I almost got my ribs crushed by Rafa Benitez in that moment. He did the majority of the filming and myself to stay overnight. You know, we'd play pool with him up in his trophy room. He'd make us quite straightforward cheese sandwiches. So sometimes we'd finish filming and like 3/4 of an hour later, he still hadn't left the room. And I said, Steven, it's yours. Take the trophy. And he goes, "You're kidding?" He put his hand out and he just stroked the outside of the box and went, and he looked up at me and he went, "Don't want to give the fucking thing back."
So today I'm joined for something a little bit different on This Is Anfield. I'm with Ned Boulting, who's a cycling commentator, but today we're talking about his football career before the cycling got off the ground, really. So thanks for coming on, Ned.
No problem at all, Sam. Not a problem.
We're going to start by talking about Steven Gerrard. Some of you might have watched it. There's a documentary in 2006, basically following Gerrard around in the season leading up to the FA Cup, the Gerrard final.
Just bend the camera around here. That's where it all happens.
Ned was working on that programme.
This would be his greatest year as a player. He's a funny mixture of things. You know, on the one hand, he's very reticent, very private, quite a hard nut to crack. But on the other hand, he's a man who's very aware of his place in the game and his legacy and his position.
You were in his house, you were going in his private life, although allotted filming days. You need to get to know him well. What did you kind of find about his character? Was he reserved at first, like he said? And he said he was a hard nut to crack. That's what Steven Gerrard is. But did he open up to you?
Yeah, he did. It wasn't straightforward. At first, we'd be allowed access to his car, his Range Rover, as we kind of like went to and from Melwood. But the moment that we got to his mansion in Formby, the kind of the electric gates would sort of shut again, you know, and we'd be out, start waving goodbye to him. So it took probably a month or two before finally, and always on his terms, it was like, are you coming in then? And then we were in, you know. I think all of us felt you were never totally sure with Steven at what point in any given day of filming he would suddenly have had enough. On the other hand, the flip side of that was he could be tremendously, you know, generous and with his time and with his hospitality. You know, he'd invite Gary, the cameraman who did the majority of the filming, and myself to stay overnight. You know, we'd play pool with him up in his trophy room. He'd make us quite straightforward cheese sandwiches in his massive kitchen from time to time, and, you know, cups of tea and all that sort of thing. And bit by bit, I did feel like I got to know him pretty well over that year. Yeah.
The year before Liverpool won the European Cup, the Champions League, and you were reporting on a lot of that story.
I think I was there for the Olympiakos night, which is right up there in terms of, I think, any experience that you could ever have shared at Anfield. And to be honest, Sam, it was my first experience of regularly going to watch European competition at Anfield under floodlights, and hearing "You'll Never Walk Alone" sung in the manner that it is, especially on a European night. It was pretty hard. I'm a neutral, you know. I don't support any club. I wasn't brought up supporting any club, so I kind of have plotted my own path through all these kind of complicated tribalisms, but it was pretty irresistible. You know, the lure of Liverpool back then was pretty irresistible. Just to kind of watch the way Gerrard operated at the centre of that universe was pretty special. The character from that squad that I got to know the best by some distance was Rafa Benitez. Rafa was someone who loved an off-the-record briefing. So sometimes we'd finish filming and like 3/4 of an hour later, he still hadn't left the room. And he'd be slagging off, sometimes Gerrard. He'd be slagging off players. He'd be saying this, that, and the other about behind their backs. But he was just testing you. He was just floating these little things out there to see what you did with these nuggets of information, whether or not you broke his confidence, you know. And he always had a little agenda. And I don't mean this in a bad way. He was playing psychological games, you know. He always had a little agenda that he wanted to push, and a little seed of something that he wanted to kind of like infiltrate you with, so that you would kind of like do his bidding for him, in a sense. He was quite smart, Rafa Benitez, but very personable as well. And I remember when the match was won in Istanbul in the penalty shootout, I was standing right next to the Liverpool dugout, effectively, and Benitez, within seconds, turned round to hug somebody, anybody. It didn't matter who it was, and it happened to be me. And I almost got my ribs crushed by Rafa Benitez in that moment, where it all came right for him.
You obviously saw some of these players develop over time.
The month of his debut, Gerrard won the League Managers Association Young Player of the Month award. So I chucked this Perspex trophy in my car and drove up to Melwood to effectively present it with him and film a little interview with this kid called Steven Gerrard. We did this interview, and it was very Gerrard, kind of quite clipped answers, very serious, a lot of frowning. And at the end of the interview, he got up to go, took off his lapel mic, and started walking out of the room without the trophy. And I said, Steven, it's yours. Take the trophy. And he goes, "You're kidding? What, I get to keep it?" And I went, "Yeah, it's yours. You just won it." So he goes, and he literally, I remember him saying, "My mum will be so proud of that." And he took it out, he took it with him, and gazing at it, and walked out of the room. And the next month, he won it again. And the same thing happened. I put another Perspex bowl or glass bowl or whatever it was in my car, drove up to Melwood, exactly the same thing again, and exactly the same thing at the end of the interview. He got up and walked off without it. And I said, "Steven, take the trophy. It's yours." And he went, "No, you're right." Just walked off without it. Here's the really interesting thing about that many years later, in 2006, when I'm filming with him in his house, and upstairs in his house, he had a trophy room, and then sort of like coming away from the centerpiece in his trophy room were all the various other different things that he'd won throughout his career, and then right at the far end of this trophy cabinet were these 2 Young Player of the Month awards. And we were filming as well, and we got to stand right next to those. And he turned to me and he said, "Do you remember?" He said, "You gave me them." And I thought that was really interesting, because think how many hundreds of football journalists had passed in front of his eyes, over those years that had intervened. And yet it was a big deal for Gerrard.
What was your one highlight in your whole journalism career?
I'll never forget going to meet Gerrard's one morning, very, very early at Liverpool Airport. And me, cameraman Gary, Paul McGrattan, his best mate, Steven Gerrard, and Rick Parry got in a very, very small private jet together. And the only other occupant of the private jet was a box about this big, and it contained the European Cup. And we were flying from Liverpool to Paris. Paris hosted the next Champions League final. There's a ceremony where the trophy is handed over by the winning captain to the next city. And I just remember everybody sort of nodding off on the plane, because it was such an early start, even though it was a short flight. Everyone fell asleep except for me and Steven. And I remember Steven just staring at the cup, and then he put his hand out and he just stroked the outside of the box and he looked up at me and he went, "Don't want to give the fucking thing back."